Uh, Hi guys, I hope you're enjoying the conference so far. So yeah, like Adam said, my name is Joanna Suau. I'm a developer educator at Infobip. And today I wanted to convince developers to basically include the Docs as Code approach, more specifically Docs as Code peer review, to be part of the developer cycle. So a little bit of a background information on me. I've been a technical author for for a decade almost now, and then I've joined the DevRel team. I started enjoying coding, started enjoying more developer, like super strictly developer oriented documentation. But the technical author is still in me, and I still deal with a lot of content. That's why I thought that this talk might interest you. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. So the aim of the talk is, as I've mentioned, kind of like convince you to join developer and docs cycles together. And I want to show how developers and technical content creators can collaborate under one process. And I think this is very important because it empowers both sides to get the best out of each other. Because at the end of the day, what we really want is an amazing user experience. If it's docs or software, we're all about user experience, right? So yeah, about this talk, what I want to do is to quickly tell you a little bit about Docs as Code, what it is, some key aspects of it, and then describe the difference between the Docs as Code peer review and the standard content review, so you kind of like know the difference between the two. And I'm going to examine where in the developer cycle we want the Docs as Code peer review to happen, and then talk a little bit about the benefits that Docs as Code brings into developer cycle and documentation itself. So let's get started. So Docs as Code in the nutshell, I asked the most powerful being right now, currently, which is ChatGPT, to kind of like spit out a one-liner on what Docs as Code is. So this is a really good definition. Like, this paragraph actually encapsulates Docs as Code approach. So let's quickly read it. The Docs as Code approach treats documentation as code, using the same tools and processes as software development to manage and publish documentation. So that's it in a nutshell. Let's just quickly look through key aspects, like what does it mean on a more granular level. So first of all, typically you write your documentation in a plain text format. And typically this would be a markdown document. Why is it so important for Docs as Code? Basically, it's text-based, plain text-based files that are super easy to access, and they are universally accessed. So you don't need any special equipment, you don't need any special software, you are not locked within some license requirements. So basically everybody can contribute. And another important thing is that the styling is abstracted from review. So your human reviewer won't be bothered by syntax. You will have automated process for that. So if you're using Markdown, you would use a linter to basically check your Markdown syntax. You could plug in any template validator, or maybe like Grammarly for developers. You can plug it in to check for copy. So what your human reviewer will just focus on would be plainly content itself, which is cost effective and time saving, right? Speaking about styling being like abstracted from the presentation, another very important aspect of Docs as code is that the front end is decoupled from the back end. So your technical content creators are solely focused on content. The content is stored at the back end and they just manage it and write there. Why is it important? So basically it frees the technical content team to deal with anything to do with the front end. So they don't have to design the elements, like the page elements. They don't have to deal with the presentation layer. All they deal with, all they have to deal with is like they just focus on content itself. So the content focus approach is when you just solely think of content structure, think of like sections, whether we have bullet points, whether we have a list, numbered list. They think about content findability, so whether your user is actually able to find the content or whether the content is buried somewhere. So they would like design a, you know, better user experience for using your documentation. And they would also think of information architecture, so how to design content silos, and then how to link these content silos, like content buckets, like getting started, and then like your overview and your conceptual documentation, how to link it together to make like a logical whole, good, amazing user experience. Another very important factor is that within your Docs as code experience, your technical content creators will use issue trackers. So everything would be, this is a Jira example because it's like the most common system to use for development. And so your documentation team will also use Jira. So they would also use, they would also measure their documentation effort. And this is important twofold. This is important because they use the same tool. They are familiar with the tool. They use, so they can access your tickets and they're familiar with it, and so they can use it, they can contribute, and they use a similar process as you're using for development, they're using for documentation. So they're actually, at some point, they're actually getting better at estimating documentation effort, which works better for development in whole, because you don't have to like ask your content creators like, when are you going to write it? You know exactly when they're going to write it because you can actually track it on a ticket, and they're actually are able to measure their effort, and documentation effort can and should be measured. Another very important aspect is that everything is stored in the version control system. To add to the simplicity, it usually is the same version control system that your development team is using. What is important here, the key aspect of the key aspect, is that the main assumption is that they're using something that is based on Git. So the assumption is that Docs as code methodology follows the Git-based systems. So your technical content creators, they should be familiar with using Git. And this is like the trickiest part because it's kind of like a steep learning curve for some people. But yeah, that's really important. And that actually, if you bring your technical authors to that level, then it's, you know, it's a whole different level of collaboration and writing documentation. The last key aspect that I thought it's important to mention is how you actually deploy your documentation, and that will actually mirror the deployment process that your company uses. so you would use something that you would use as many automated systems as possible. So and you would typically you would use a static site generator for your documentation, and then you will pass it through a lot of automated systems to check your build, to check your syntax. We've mentioned the markdown linting devices and stuff. And also you could plug in something that allows you for single sourcing. For instance, I heard a talk about of a lady who worked for Grammarly, and she's mentioned that she worked for MongoDB, and they did something really cool that really spoke to me. They single sourced their code samples. What they did is, because their documentation was stored at the back end, and their technical content creators, technical authors, were familiar with a little bit of a little bit of syntax, and they were able to actually pull lines of code straight from the source code. So every time source code was updated, their documentation, their code samples were updated as well together, which is amazing from maintenance point of view. And also from time efficiency. Your technical authors, they don't have to create code samples. The code samples are actually created for them, and they just choose which lines they want to display in their documentation. So yeah, these were all like key aspects of Docs as code. I hope you are like more familiar with it now. So I wanted to speak a little bit about the Docs as code peer review. So the gist of the talk. So again, we're going to mention some key aspects of it, and the first key aspect would be that it is built on a foundation of version control. It is important because at the end of the day, you don't want to end up with a lot of versions of like different files. What you want to do is you want to have a single source of truth that is backed up by the principles of version control. So it's you don't lose content, you don't lose feedback, and you can employ as many reviewers as possible into your documentation, and you are not afraid of like losing content. So yeah, we've mentioned multiple reviewers. So it is super important to mention that it is very easy to incorporate, in comparison, very easy to incorporate feedback from multiple reviewers. And why is it important? It's important because it elevates the quality of the document. You have a bigger context, right? So typically what you would do as a technical author, you would go to a subject matter expert. That would typically be the developer who developed the feature that you want to describe. And it's kind of like going to a parent and asking a parent to be objective about their baby. It's impossible. Like they just created this, this baby. They love it. They love the feature. So it's really hard for them to be objective. So what you would do, you would then go to your tester and you'll be like, okay, so what is this feature about? Like, are there any limitations? Does it really work? Like, with all the bells and whistles, like our developer is describing. So the tester will actually give you a little bit more of a context. You can go and invite your product owner into the review, and the product owner will tell you everything from their customer perspective, like, what did the customer really want? Maybe we need to add some, FAQ. Maybe we need to add some, user stories, so it's more approachable to the customer in question. So thanks to that, you're not afraid that you're going to lose that feedback. You're not afraid that you're going to end up with like thousands of different files with different comments. Everything is backed up by version control. And also everything is approachable. So you use the same tools as you would use for code review. This is an example of a Bitbucket. And I think it's important to mention the fact that it has to be a tool where you can add comments, because your product owners would love to. This is from my point of view, from my experience of working with different companies, with different teams. A lot of product owners, they just love to leave comments. So if you have a tool that is Git based and allows you to add comments, you're golden. So it encourages collaboration, it encourages feedback, and it encourages better, more comprehensive documentation, because you have a lot of input to work with. And it works both ways. So it works better for a technical content creator, but it also works better for developers, because now your technical authors, they know the tool, so they can in turn participate in your reviews. They can review quickly and efficiently. They can review your readmes. They can review your description tags in your YAML files. They can review documentation tags in your XML projects. They can even review your inline code comments. All of that will be done. You don't have to send a screenshot and ask them and do it yourself. Everything is within this one process, within this one well-oiled machine. And speaking about the process, you are all using the same process. So both sides are familiar with the process. The process feels natural to everybody. You can complain about the process together over coffee. And it's the industry standard in the development world. So I think that everybody should use it. I don't think documentation should have a separate process, which is usually the case in my experience. So speaking about processes, let's take a look at the process of how a standard review looks like and how it differs from the Docs as Code peer review. First and foremost, you typically end up with a multiple version of the source file, which, as I've mentioned before, it's quite difficult to handle. It's prone to human error, and potentially you'll be losing valuable content. You are constrained to your tooling of your choice. Typically, it is very difficult to share a single sourced copy between various reviewers. For instance, I've worked a lot with all of the tools that are mentioned here. But speaking of Madcap Flare, for instance, they have a license. So even if you are using their online version, which allows you to invite different reviewers and they can access your content, it is still locked within a license. So you can buy several seats for reviewers. So you have to. It's not cost effective because you have to buy a license, then you have to buy a license separately for the reviewers. So it's all, you are constrained by the tool and limited by license requirements. And also, you need to tell your developer how to access that file, how to work with that file. You usually have a different process because of that. Then you have to go and manually, tweak something. So again, you need to have a clearly defined documentation reviewing process as opposed to going with a industry standard. And obviously, I've mentioned it, just wanted to super highlight this. It is not easy to incorporate multiple reviewers' feedback. And as controversial as I may sound right now, resolving a conflict on your branch is not as difficult as trying to, incorporating not only like comments, but also inlay comments and also like tweaks to your file. It is messy, so it is easier to actually work with different branches, work with different file versions, in my opinion. So how does the docs as code work within a dev cycle? So like the main assumption is that you have one universal environment into which code and documentation is incorporated in a similar manner. How it works in detail: you've got your developer cycle. So let's just talk about it for a little bit. So first you've got your planning, right? Then you go through, you go to the designers, then they design some mock-ups, right? You start implementing, you start writing code. Then it hopefully goes through testing, and then you release it, and then your code enters the maintenance stage. So the next slide will actually show you how to strap the entire documentation cycle, including the peer review, into your dev process. So that's how it looks like. So during your planning session, you can invite your technical author, or you can record a session and the technical author can just get the gist of it and skip all the irrelevant parts. And they can, at this point, they can already identify whether there is any existing documentation that needs changing, whether there is any new documentation they need to write, what type of documentation they will need. So at the very beginning, they can already participate and they can already start thinking about it. During the mock-up phase, what your technical author can already do is to create a skeleton of content, thinking like what section, review the content type again. So it is well-planned process. And they can start writing right around, like in between implementation and testing. I'm just a sucker for symmetry, so I didn't want to move the the orange bits. But yeah, they start writing, and your review happens around between between testing and release, right? Again, a little bit moved, but that's where your review takes place. Then you publish together with the code, and that's usually the case, right? So the publishing process usually happens together with documentation, but with a standard development versus documentation process, in my experience, you just end up developers end up going to a documentation person 2 days before the release. And they're like, oh yeah, we forgot, there is this feature, can you quickly document it? And with that process, they are aware from the beginning, and they kind of drive the initiative. So they will tell you which documents, and they will be more proactive, which works wonderfully both ways. So let's quickly recap. Benefits for the dev cycle. We've mentioned, again, the same process for code and for documentation. And it's important because of efficiency, and it empowers collaboration in between teams and within a team. And it's cost effective because you don't end up going to a meeting where you have to have a handover and explain everything, and then another meeting just for documentation, because context is also important. It is important for a technical author to actually be there and know the process of and all pain points of creating that feature, because then they are able to provide more context to their users thanks to that. And we've mentioned the fact that code and documentation runs in a parallel cycle, and it's updated in parallel. Your documentation is not treated as an afterthought. It's not compiled in a hurry. It is well planned, right? So at the end of the day, better user experience. Documentation is easily accessible. It is extremely important because, first of all, it encourages openness within the company, so everybody can contribute, and it does exactly that. It empowers other people to actually give their thoughts and empowers them to contribute to documentation. Documentation is not something like, oh yes, this is just documentation creators thing to do, and this is something that nobody reads. You're now starting thinking, oh, this is something that I read, this is something that your end user read, this is something that my customers read. So you have your voice and you can contribute. You can create a pull request contributing to your documentation, and it will be, you know, taken care of. And it adds more context to content itself, right? We've mentioned that before as well. So yeah, let's also take a quick look at what benefits Docs as Code brings to documentation. First and foremost, and this is the most important part, is that your documentation is always up to date. So you don't end up with stale documents. Because it's an inherent part of your process, you don't overlook it. You don't minimize its importance. You have the efficient and clear review process, and we've mentioned this is an industry standard. Everybody knows it, and so a lot of technical authors, they work within the developer cycle, or you know, next to the developer cycle. So a lot of technical authors already are familiar with that process, so there's no need for them to invent. This is like additional hurdle for them to do, and it also minimizes the hiring effort, because you have bigger pool now from people. You can even so you can go to a developer educator, you can go to a technical writer, and you can you know, more people. I can assure you that more people will be interested in a job where they don't have to work in a silo, where they can actually contribute to the developer cycle. This is like a dream for us technical authors, I can assure you. And you end up with an improved quality of your documentation. It is better planned because they've been within the entire cycle. They are aware of everything. They have a better context. More people reviewed it. More people voiced their opinion. So your documentation is also more comprehensive. And you're basically ending up with the best possible user experience, hopefully, be it documentation and software. And that's it. Thank you so much. I hope you found this talk useful to some extent. And just wanted to mention that I'm from Infobip, and we have a lot of t-shirts and wonderful swag. So if you haven't grabbed your t-shirt, just come and chat me up at the booth.